Elias had always been drawn to the unknown. Ever since he was a child, he had a fascination with distant stars, strange creatures, and the endless mysteries of the universe. That curiosity had led him to a remote planetary outpost on the edge of human exploration, a place where the air was thin, the terrain was harsh, and danger could appear in the blink of an eye. The outpost itself was small, a cluster of metallic buildings clinging to the jagged rocks of the planet. But it was home to Elias and a handful of other scientists and researchers who shared his love for discovery. Life there was quiet, routine, and often lonely. But Elias liked it that way. He enjoyed the isolation, the way it allowed him to focus on his work and to feel connected to the universe in a way he never had on Earth. One cold, pale morning, Elias set out on a routine expedition to study the local wildlife. The creatures on this planet were unlike anything he had seen before. Some were massive, lumbering beasts with thick, protective hides, while others were small and delicate, darting through the rocks like shadows. He walked carefully, scanning the terrain with his scanner, making notes of tracks and markings, and occasionally pausing to observe a creature from a safe distance. He had always been cautious, always aware that some of these creatures could be dangerous. But he never expected to find what he did that day. As he rounded a jagged outcrop of rock, he noticed something unusual. At first, he thought it might be a small animal caught in a trap, but as he drew closer, his eyes widened in surprise. There, lying on the cold ground, was a child. Though it was not human, its skin shimmered with an otherworldly glow, a pale blue that seemed to pulse slightly with its heartbeat. Its limbs were thin and delicate, almost fragile, and its eyes were wide and filled with fear. It was clearly injured, its small body trembling with pain and exhaustion. Elias froze for a moment, unsure what to do. He knew that the aliens from this species had been hostile in the past. They had attacked human settlements, leaving destruction in their wake. Most people on the outpost would see this child as an enemy, as a threat. But Elias could not ignore the look in its eyes. There was innocence there and vulnerability, and something inside him stirred. Without thinking about the consequences, he moved closer, speaking softly in a language the child could not understand. He knelt beside it, gently examining the injuries. Its arm was bent at an unnatural angle, and there were deep cuts along its legs. Elias knew that leaving it here would mean certain death. Despite every warning, every rule, and every fear, he made a decision that would change his life forever. He would help this child. Carefully, he lifted the small body into his arms, feeling how light and fragile it was. The child did not resist. It seemed to sense that he meant no harm. Elias wrapped it in a thermal blanket he carried for emergencies and began the long journey back to the outpost. The trek was difficult. The rocks were sharp and uneven, and the wind howled through the canyons, chilling him to the bone. Every step he took, he felt the weight of the decision he had made. If anyone saw him, they would question his judgment. Some might even accuse him of betrayal. But he pushed those thoughts aside. The child's life was more important than fear or doubt. When he finally reached the outpost, the first thing he noticed was the suspicious looks from his colleagues. They had seen him arrive with the glowing figure in his arms, and whispers had already begun to circulate. Elias ignored them, carrying the child inside and laying it gently on a makeshift bed in one of the lab rooms. He checked the injuries, again applying antiseptic and bandages as carefully as he could. The child whimpered softly, a sound that tugged at Elias's heart, but did not cry out in fear. There was a quiet intelligence in its eyes, a depth that was almost human. Over the next few hours, Elias worked tirelessly. He fed the child a nutrient paste he had prepared for experiments, adjusted the temperature in the room to make it comfortable, and monitored its breathing. He learned to interpret its small gestures, how it indicated hunger, discomfort, or curiosity. Slowly, a fragile trust began to form between them. The child, who had arrived trembling and frightened, began to relax in his presence, leaning slightly against him as if seeking comfort. Despite the growing bond, Elias knew the danger was far from over. This child was the offspring of a species that humans feared, and its mother, if alive, would undoubtedly be searching. The consequences of harboring this alien child could be severe. Yet, as he watched the tiny figure resting peacefully, he realized that there was no other choice. Compassion had outweighed fear, and he could not undo the decision he had made. Throughout the day, Elias reflected on what this moment meant. He had always believed in the importance of understanding, in reaching across divides to find common ground. But this was more than understanding. This was an act of courage, of moral conviction. He was protecting a life, not for personal gain or recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. And in that quiet, stark lab room on the edge of an alien world, he felt a strange sense of purpose, a connection to something greater than himself. By nightfall, Elias had made the child comfortable and secured the room. He sat beside it, keeping watch, listening to the gentle sounds of its breathing. Outside, the wind continued to howl, and the planet seemed indifferent to the small drama unfolding within the outpost. Yet, for Elias, everything had changed. He no longer saw the world in simple terms of friend and enemy. He had glimpsed the complexity of life, the fragility of innocence, and the strength of compassion. As he drifted into a light sleep, still keeping one eye on the child, Elias knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges. He would have to explain his actions, face questions, and perhaps even danger. But for the first time in his life, he felt certain that he had done the right thing. The child's life was in his hands, and he was ready to protect it, no matter the cost. And somewhere in the vast expanse of the universe, beyond the jagged rocks and thin air, the threads of fate had begun to weave a story that would change both human and alien lives forever. Days passed, and Elias grew closer to the child he had saved. He continued to call her Lyra, a name he had chosen because it felt gentle and easy for both of them. Every morning, he would check her injuries, carefully change the bandages, and prepare her food. The nutrient paste he gave her was not something she would naturally eat, but he patiently guided her to understand that it would make her strong again. With each passing day, Lyra's strength returned. She began to move more on her own, lifting her small limbs with a determined energy that amazed Elias. Despite her alien appearance, there was something profoundly human in her gestures and expressions. She smiled occasionally, a tiny curve of her lips, and those moments filled Elias with hope. Their bond grew quietly. Elias began to teach Lyra simple skills that would help her survive in the world around them. He showed her how to recognize safe plants, how to move quietly over the rocky terrain, and how to avoid dangerous creatures that lurked near the outpost. At first, she was hesitant and unsure, but with gentle encouragement, she began to imitate his actions. Elias was patient, knowing that she had been through trauma and fear. Every small success, every time she learned to catch a small creature for food or navigate a tricky path, was met with quiet pride on his part and a shy, curious look from Lyra. It was not just practical skills that Elias focused on. He spoke to her, though she could not understand the words. He told her stories of the stars, of distant worlds, and of humans who had faced great challenges yet acted with courage. He hoped that even if she did not understand his language, the tone of kindness and safety would reach her. Slowly it did. She began to respond to him, not with words but with gestures, a touch of his hand, a tilt of her head, or a soft sound that seemed like a laugh. These small signs reassured Elias that his care was not in vain. Outside the outpost, the planet seemed indifferent to the drama unfolding within its walls. The wind howled through the canyons, carrying dust and tiny pebbles across the jagged landscape. Strange creatures roamed the hills, some curious, some dangerous, but inside the walls, Elias and Lyra created a small world of safety. It was fragile, temporary, and entirely dependent on his vigilance. Every night he would sit beside her bed, watching over her as she slept, ready to react to any sound, any movement that might signal danger. The responsibility weighed heavily on him, but he welcomed it. For the first time in a long while, he felt a deep sense of purpose. Unbeknownst to Elias, their small world was being watched. Far beyond the outpost, in the shadows of the alien forests, Lyra's mother, Zira, observed them. Zira was not like the creatures Elias had encountered before. She was tall, elegant, and radiated an intelligence that made even the bravest humans pause. She had been searching tirelessly for her child, following traces of her movements across the planet. When she found Lyra, she was injured and alone, but she saw something that surprised her. A human caring for her offspring, treating her not as a prisoner, not as a weapon, but with genuine concern. At first, Zira's reaction was confusion. She had known humans to be aggressive, selfish, and ruthless. But here was one who had acted against every expectation, risking his own safety for her child. She watched as Elias fed Lyra, cleaned her wounds, and guided her through small tasks. She saw the trust forming between them, the bond of care and respect. And slowly something unexpected grew within Zira. Fascination. She was drawn not only to Elias's courage but to the depth of his empathy, something rare and powerful even among her own kind. Back at the outpost, Elias began to notice subtle changes in Lyra's behavior. She started to respond more quickly to his instructions, sometimes anticipating what he wanted before he even spoke. She followed him around the lab and the small compound with an eagerness that made Elias smile. Sometimes she would imitate his movements, carefully balancing as he did, or attempt to mimic his gestures. It was clear she was learning, adapting, and thriving in the safety he provided. Elias could feel a growing connection, a silent understanding that went beyond words. Yet danger lingered. The outpost was not a completely safe place. Some of his colleagues had begun to suspect something unusual. Questions were asked. Eyes followed him when he entered and left the lab. Elias felt the pressure, building but remained focused. He knew that the child's life depended on him keeping her safe. Every glance from his colleagues was a reminder of the delicate balance he had created. One wrong move, one moment of carelessness, and everything could collapse. But he refused to be intimidated. Compassion, he knew, often required courage that went beyond physical strength. Elias also began to notice his own emotions shifting. The bond he shared with Lyra was no longer just about responsibility. He felt a protective instinct that was deep and personal. Seeing her small smile after successfully completing a task or hearing the soft, curious noises she made filled him with a sense of joy he had not experienced in years. Each moment of trust she placed in him strengthened his resolve. He knew that he would not abandon her no matter the risks, no matter the threats from the outside world. Meanwhile, Zira continued to observe. Her fascination grew into something more complex. She admired Elias, yes, but she also felt a pull toward him, a recognition that he was unlike anyone she had encountered before. His bravery, his unwavering moral compass, and his ability to nurture a life so different from his own sparked a mixture of respect, curiosity, and a quiet desire to understand him. She remained hidden, careful not to reveal herself yet, but every day she returned to watch, learning from his actions, studying his character, and silently acknowledging the rare humanity he displayed. As the days turned into a week, the bond between Elias and Lyra became undeniable. They had developed a routine, a rhythm of life that was comforting to both. Elias would wake early to check the temperature, feed Lyra, and teach her small lessons. She would follow him with curiosity, learning the layout of the outpost, the ways to move safely, and the signals he used to communicate. Even in the face of danger, in the midst of an unforgiving planet, they created a world together, one of safety, trust, and growing affection. Elias knew that challenges were ahead. He could not protect Lyra forever in secret. Questions would arise, dangers would approach, and her mother might eventually confront them. But for now, in this fragile bubble of time, they had found something extraordinary. A bond had formed, one that transcended species, history, and fear. Elias had taken a step that many would have avoided, and in doing so he discovered the profound truth that compassion and courage could bridge even the greatest divides. And somewhere beyond the rocks and canyons, hidden from view, Zira continued to watch, quietly realizing that the human who had saved her child was far more remarkable than she had ever imagined. The story that had begun with fear and uncertainty was evolving into something none of them could have predicted. A story of connection, courage, and the quiet, unstoppable power of care. The fragile peace that Elias had created in the outpost was about to be tested. Word had a way of moving faster than he expected, and soon, whispers began to circulate among the human staff. Some had noticed the glowing child in his care, the way he seemed to protect her from view, and the unusual bond that had formed. Questions were asked quietly at first, but suspicion grew with each passing day. People who once respected Elias began to look at him with uncertainty. They whispered about whether he could be trusted, whether harboring the child was wise, and whether he had placed them all in danger. Elias felt the weight of their eyes on him, but he refused to be swayed. His focus remained on Lyra, on her safety, and on the promise he had made silently to himself when he first found her. Outside the walls of the outpost, the danger was also increasing. Zira, Lyra's mother, had been tracking her daughter across the planet, following faint energy, signatures and signs left behind. When she discovered that a human was caring for Lyra, her reaction was complex. Anger surged first. How dare a human touch her child? How dare they interfere? But as she observed from a distance, her feelings shifted. Elias's care for Lyra was meticulous, gentle, and consistent. She saw how he cleaned her wounds, how he nourished her, and how he guided her through learning new skills. There was no malice in his actions, no attempt to harm or control. He was, in every way, protecting the child. Zira's fascination grew into a complicated mix of respect, curiosity, and a quiet admiration. She realized that Elias was different from the humans she had known, different from the enemies who had attacked her people in the past. He was fearless in his empathy, courageous in his actions, and unwavering in his moral conviction. And though she tried to deny it to herself, she felt a strange pull toward him, not just for his strength or skill, but for the kindness and courage he displayed, qualities rare even among her own kind. Back at the outpost, Elias noticed the tension building around him. Some of his colleagues had begun asking pointed questions, hinting at suspicions they had only whispered before. He had to tread carefully. One misstep could expose Lyra to danger, or worse, provoke the anger of humans who did not understand her, or aliens who might come seeking her. Every day he devised new ways to keep her safe, from hiding her in secure rooms to creating diversions and false trails that would confuse anyone trying to find her. It was exhausting work, but Elias did not complain. He knew the stakes were high and the responsibility was his alone to bear. Despite the looming danger, Elias and Lyra's bond continued to grow. Lyra began to understand more of his words, picking up simple instructions and even attempting to repeat them. Her alien sounds became more expressive, and she would sometimes try to mimic his gestures or movements. Elias found himself laughing at her small successes, encouraging her with smiles and soft words. He marveled at her resilience and intelligence. Even in a world that had been unkind to her, she was learning to trust, to hope, and to grow. One evening, as Elias prepared dinner, he noticed something unusual outside the outpost. A faint glow moved in the distance, subtle but distinct. He felt a familiar sense of unease. It was Zira. She had come closer than before, watching silently, assessing him, and learning. Elias sensed her presence without seeing her fully, a feeling that prickled the edges of his awareness. He did not panic, though. He had learned to stay calm under pressure. He knew that confrontation might come, but he also understood that fear could cloud judgment. He continued his work, carefully preparing Lyra's meal and keeping her calm, even as his mind raced with possibilities. Zira's approach was cautious. She did not reveal herself outright, understanding the risk of startling Elias or frightening Lyra. She watched how he moved, how he interacted with the child, and how he handled the growing tension around him. She observed his patience, his attentiveness, and the quiet strength that guided every action. Every detail impressed her. She realized that this human was unlike any she had encountered before. He was not just brave, he was honorable, selfless, and unwavering in his principles. Her fascination deepened, and she felt a pull toward him that she could not explain. Meanwhile, the whispers among the human staff became more urgent. A few approached Elias directly, questioning his choices. "Why are you hiding her?" One asked, suspicion lacing the words. "You know what she represents. You know the danger." Elias met their gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated. "She is a child," he said simply. "Nothing more. She is hurt, and I am keeping her safe. That is all that matters." Some shook their heads, unconvinced, but Elias held firm. He had chosen a path of compassion, and he would not waver, even under scrutiny. As days passed, the tension continued to grow. Lyra's presence was no longer a secret, and the consequences of harboring her could be severe. Yet, in the midst of these pressures, Elias's relationship with her strengthened. He found comfort in her small smiles, her curious gestures, and the trust she placed in him. He began to see her not just as a child to protect, but as a living reminder of what kindness and courage could accomplish. She had survived because he had acted, and her growth and trust became a source of quiet pride and determination. Zyra, observing from afar, began to understand more about Elias than she expected. She saw the strength it took to protect another, life in the face of danger, the courage to act against fear and suspicion, and the quiet joy that came from nurturing and teaching. She realized that his actions were not motivated by strategy, fear, or personal gain. They were driven by something deeper, a sense of moral duty and empathy that transcended species, history, and past conflicts. Her fascination grew into something more profound, a desire to understand him, to know what made him act with such unwavering care, and a subtle, unspoken admiration that warmed her in ways she had not anticipated. Elias, for his part, remained focused on Lyra. He understood the risks, but he also understood the importance of trust, compassion, and moral conviction. Every decision he made was guided by the knowledge that her life depended on him. Every movement, every gesture, every word of reassurance was calculated to protect her while building a foundation of trust. And as he watched her grow stronger, more confident and more curious, he felt a quiet satisfaction. He had made a choice that would not only change her life, but would shape his own in ways he could not yet imagine. The stage was set for confrontation. Humans were becoming more suspicious. Alien forces were moving closer, and Zyra's presence loomed just beyond reach. Elias knew that the choices he made in the coming days could determine not just Lyra's future, but the fragile balance between humans and aliens on the planet. Yet even as the tension mounted, he remained calm, steadfast, and determined. Compassion, he understood, was not weakness. It was strength, courage, and vision all in one. And as he held Lyra close that night, watching her drift into a peaceful sleep, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with the same unwavering determination that had brought him this far. In the shadows beyond the outpost, Zyra lingered, captivated and conflicted. She had found a human who defied expectations, who cared for her child in ways she had never imagined. Her respect and fascination were growing into something more profound, something that neither of them could yet fully understand. The human, who had protected her child, had changed the rules of engagement, not through force but through courage, empathy, and unwavering moral strength. And as she watched Elias silently, she realized that the story was far from over. Elias knew the tension was reaching a breaking point. Every glance from his colleagues, every subtle question, reminded him that harboring Lyra could have serious consequences. He had done what he felt was right, but he could no longer ignore the potential fallout. One wrong step, one careless word, and everything he had built, the trust, the safety, the fragile peace, could be shattered in an instant. Yet, he could not abandon Lyra. She had survived against the odds, and she had grown to rely on him completely. To leave her now would be more than a moral failure. It would be an act that neither of them could recover from. The problem was complicated further by Zira's presence. Her attention was no longer subtle. Elias could sense it, a quiet force observing his every move, almost like the planet itself was aware of her presence. He had heard the faint hums and vibrations that preceded her arrival, and noticed unusual patterns in the wildlife around the outpost. Zira was powerful, far more skilled and experienced than any human. He knew she could take Lyra at any moment, if she chose to. But he also saw in her actions a restraint that hinted at a deeper curiosity, a respect or even admiration. Elias understood that he was walking a delicate line. The human staff grew more insistent. Some confronted him directly. "You are risking all of us," one said. "You can't protect her forever. She belongs to her species." Elias looked at them steadily, feeling a quiet strength rising within him. "She is a child," he replied simply. "Not an enemy, not a threat. She is living, and she needs care. That is all I will consider." His words were met with skepticism, some nods of grudging respect and some eyes filled with doubt. Elias ignored the whispers, focusing on Lyra and the choices he needed to make. Zira finally revealed herself in full, stepping out from the shadows of the alien forest one evening. She appeared as a figure of light and elegance, her presence both commanding and unsettling. Elias did not flinch. He had expected confrontation, yet the way she moved, the measured way she approached, told him that this encounter would be unlike any other. She spoke, her voice deep, calm, and resonant. "You have protected my child," she said. "Why?" Elias considered his answer carefully. "Because it is right," he said. "Because she is innocent. Because anyone would do the same if they could." Her eyes studied him closely, and Elias could sense her growing fascination. She saw something in him she had not expected, a human who could act against fear and history, a being whose compassion could not be bent by threat or suspicion. Zira acknowledged the risks he had taken and the courage it demanded, and though she could not admit it fully, a strange desire began to stir within her, one born not from possession, but from respect, curiosity, and an unspoken recognition of his strength of character. Elias realized that he could not simply hand Lyra over without consequences. Doing so would break her trust, undermine the bond they had built, and place her in the hands of someone she had never known, no matter how loving or capable. Yet, defying Zira openly could provoke a dangerous conflict between humans and her species. The moral dilemma weighed heavily on him. He had promised protection, but now the stakes included not only Lyra's life but the fragile relationship between two species that had long been in tension. He spent days considering options, observing Zira from a distance, and gauging her intentions. He noticed her patience, her unwillingness to harm Lyra directly, and her careful study of his actions. She seemed intrigued by his decisions, the way he balanced risk with care, and the way he remained calm even under pressure. Elias realized that she was testing him, not to provoke but to understand the depth of his commitment, and he knew he had to be honest with himself about his own feelings. Protecting Lyra had awakened a courage and determination in him that he had not realized existed. He was willing to face danger, suspicion, and even potential hostility to keep her safe. Elias decided on a careful strategy. He began to prepare Lyra for the possibility of meeting her mother, teaching her to recognize Zira without fear. He also created subtle signals to communicate with Zira, showing that he was not a threat but a protector. He wanted to establish a dialogue, a trust, that would prevent violence and allow Lyra to remain safe. It was a delicate dance, a balance of empathy, courage, and foresight. The days leading up to the potential confrontation were tense. Elias and Lyra continued their routines, each small success reinforcing the trust they shared. Elias saw her curiosity grow, her intelligence shine, and her resilience strengthen. She was learning not only survival skills but also the meaning of loyalty and care. And through it all, Elias felt a quiet pride, knowing that his choices had given her the opportunity to grow in a world that could have been cruel and unforgiving. Finally, The moment came when dialogue became unavoidable. Zira approached openly, but Elias met her calmly. He spoke honestly about his commitment to Lyra, about the choices he had made, and about the bond that had formed between them. Zira listened, her respect deepening, her fascination growing, and a subtle, unspoken connection forming between them. They both understood that the future of Lyra's safety depended on trust, cooperation, and mutual respect. In that understanding, Elias found clarity. He could not abandon Lyra, but he could build a bridge with Zira that might protect them all. And so the stage was set for a new chapter, a path that required courage, diplomacy, and empathy, a journey where moral conviction and compassion would guide the choices that could determine the fate of a child, and perhaps the future relationship between their species. And empathy were not fleeting but intrinsic to who he was. Zira's fascination transformed into admiration, and a quiet, subtle connection formed between them. Elias realized that he had to find a way to ensure Lyra's long-term safety while respecting Zira's role as her mother. He suggested measures that would allow Lyra to grow with both of them involved, without putting her at risk. He proposed routines, shared responsibilities, and safe boundaries that allowed each to act in Lyra's best interest. Zira, initially skeptical, began to see the wisdom in his plan. She recognized that his moral conviction, tempered by practicality, made him a partner she could trust, even as she remained protective of her child. The human staff gradually accepted the reality of the situation. Some were still wary, but many began to admire Elias's courage. They saw how he balanced compassion with caution, how he protected Lyra without losing sight of the dangers, and how he navigated the delicate interactions with Zira. His actions became a quiet example of integrity, demonstrating that even in a world divided by fear and history, moral courage and empathy could create bridges that others could not. Lyra herself began to thrive. With both Elias and Zira involved, she learned to navigate her world with confidence. She understood that the humans and aliens could coexist in her life, and she grew stronger, more resilient, and more curious about the universe around her. Her bond with Elias deepened, rooted in trust, safety, and the knowledge that he had risked everything to protect her. Zira, observing this, felt both pride and awe. Her child was flourishing because of the human who had acted with courage and compassion, and she could not deny the admiration she felt toward him. Over time, the tentative alliance between humans and Zira's people began to take shape. What had started as suspicion and fear evolved into cautious cooperation. Elias played a key role in facilitating this understanding, demonstrating that trust, empathy, and moral conviction could bridge divides that had seemed insurmountable. The outpost became a symbol of hope, a place where humans and aliens could learn to coexist and work together, guided by the example of one man who had chosen compassion over fear. Elias and Zira's relationship remained complex but respectful. Her desire for him was intertwined with admiration for his courage, respect for his moral integrity, and recognition of the rare kindness he had shown. It was not simple attraction, but a profound acknowledgement of his character and the choices he had made. Elias in turn understood her position, recognizing the responsibility she bore as a mother and leader. Their connection was rooted in mutual respect, trust, and the shared goal of protecting Lyra and building a better future. In the end, the story was one of transformation. A child had been saved through courage and compassion. A bond had formed between human and alien that transcended fear and history. Relationships had been reshaped, trust had been earned, and a small corner of the universe had become a place of hope and cooperation. Elias had risked everything to do what was right, and in doing so, he had changed lives, built bridges, and demonstrated the enduring power of empathy and moral courage. Lyra thrived, Elias's courage was recognized, and Zira's respect and admiration grew into a quiet, enduring connection. The universe remained vast and uncertain, but within this outpost a story of bravery, compassion, and the transformative power of care had been written, a story that would ripple far beyond the jagged rocks of the remote planet, inspiring others to act with courage, kindness, and integrity. And so, a life once defined by isolation and routine became extraordinary. A child's survival, a mother's admiration, and a human's unwavering moral courage combined to create a story of hope, connection, and the quiet, unstoppable force of compassion that could change even the most dangerous, divided world.